We did calculations to confirm that the residual thrust from that engine would not have had the energy to have this effect. That confirmed that the thrust reversers couldn't actually have played any role, or significant role anyway, in the fire's severity.
Clearly, something other than the thrusters had caused the fire to spread so quickly. Prothero looks more closely at the data. After examining weather reports from the day of the accident, he finds the answer.
The wind was the main factor that determined the severity of the fire in terms of its attack on the outside of the aircraft, how rapidly it penetrated the aircraft, and it also affected the conditions inside the cabin.
Believing he had blown a tire, Captain Terrington made a fateful decision.
Stopping. 28 Mike, we are abandoning takeoff.
Well, when we heard the thud and we closed the throttles, it was my assumption that we were going to turn off the runway, clear the runway, ask air traffic for an engineer to come out and check the tyres.
Like a highway, an airport runway has a series of exits. Captain Terrington chose one called Link Delta.
So we've got a fire on number 1.
When we got the additional information of a fire warning, the brain was already programmed to carry out the stop.
The crew had been aware that they had a fire, but didn't really appreciate at the time the nature of the fire, the severity of the fire, so they had turned off the runway.
Captain Terrington turned his plane to the right and brought it to a stop. He couldn't have realized that doing so would make the problem far worse.
There was a crosswind, a slight crosswind, from the left side of the aircraft that was carrying the fire that was burning from the fuel that was pulled underneath the left wing. It carried that fire aft, rearwards, and took over and under the rear fuselage, in between the wing and the tailplane.
The wind wrapped the fire around the back of the plane and into the cabin.
If there'd been no wind at all, I think the situation would have been very much more benign.
Investigators have discovered how the fire started and the conditions that caused it to penetrate the cabin. Now investigator Ed Trimble must solve the biggest mystery surrounding the Manchester accident.
Here we had an aircraft which had aborted the takeoff for good reason, had taxied off and stopped in a taxiway in an expeditious manner, and yet 55 people had lost their lives. So there was a big question as to precisely why that had occurred.
Investigators learned that most of the dead were not found in the worst burned parts of the plane. Autopsies will point to the real killer on Flight 28. Of the 54 people who died in the cabin, only 6 had suffered serious burns. All the rest died from smoke inhalation. It seems the smoke in the cabin was particularly lethal. Survivors tell investigators that the smoke was unbearable.
The smoke was really black, and it was almost touching. It was really weird.
And they say the effect of that was shocking. Immediately you took one breath of the smoke, you began to feel debilitated, and you knew that if you took another breath or two, you weren't going to make it.
At the time of the Manchester accident, the effects of fire on an airplane had been well studied and understood, but the effects of smoke were not. To figure out what made the smoke so toxic, Trimble decides to recreate the fire that burned on Flight 28.
We were trying to model not only the gases which were produced, but also the kind of threat levels which were produced.
The smoke that filled the plane was from materials burning inside the cabin. The foam in the seats, the wool in the carpets, and the plastic overhead bins all release poisonous fumes. Those conditions are recreated by burning those same materials. Trimble discovers the passengers on Flight 28 inhaled smoke that contained a deadly blend of poisonous gases, including high levels of carbon monoxide and hydrogen cyanide. Now he desperately needs to find out if there's any way to protect airline passengers from that kind of smoke.
So it seemed to me pretty clear that unless we could protect people's respiratory systems from the assault from such combustion gases, there was little that we could do to improve survival chances from aircraft fires.
Over the course of 5 weeks, investigators run dozens of tests, experimenting with different filters. They burn nearly a quarter ton of material to create the necessary smoke. Their dramatic conclusion: it may have been possible to save passengers' lives.
There was not the slightest doubt in my mind that in these situations, in an aircraft cabin, if it is being assaulted by combustion gases, your chances of survival are vastly improved if you have smoke hood protection.
British Air Tours Flight 28 had only enough smoke hoods for the crew. They were never used. Trimble's research indicates that smoke hoods for passengers could have saved lives.
There were hoods available, both of the filter type and the breathable gas type, which can provide a very high level of protection to people in these circumstances.
Many of the passengers on Flight 28 would have survived with a few more minutes of breathing time.
It was in a blink of an eye, you know, from the time, you know, we stopped on the runway, you know, just within a few minutes, and it was all over, really.
A full Boeing 737 is designed to be evacuated in less than 2 minutes. So even without additional time, more of the passengers on Flight 28 should have been able to get off. To discover why so many people never made it off the plane, investigators turned to an unlikely source for the answer. By law, airplane manufacturers must prove their planes can be evacuated quickly and safely. When the 737 was introduced in the UK, Boeing demonstrated that 130 people could get off the plane in just 75 seconds.
All public transport aircraft are certificated to the same criteria, and that is that the total complement of passengers must be capable of evacuating from the aircraft using half the exits in the aircraft, generally one side or the other, within a maximum of 90 seconds.
But 90 seconds after Flight 28 came to a stop, most of the passengers were still on board.
The reason why the evacuation in Manchester wasn't achieved in 90 seconds is because the conditions in a real fire evacuation are completely different from the certification conditions.
The certification evacuation is conducted in clear conditions, with no smoke that reduces vision and overwhelms passengers. Within minutes of coming to a stop, Flight 28 filled with thick black smoke.
As soon as the smoke began to spill into the rear cabin and then flow forwards, essentially that induced immediate panic in those who were so affected by the smoke, because their respiration, I mean, the typical comment was, I took one breath of smoke and I felt as though my lungs were solidifying. You can imagine under these conditions that people